Hey YouTube, welcome back to X-Ray Tech, giving you an inside look at PC hardware. This CPU here is the Phenom II X6 1090T processor from AMD. You see, back in the late 2000s, all AMD had to offer was a 4-core chip called the X4965. While this was a solid piece of engineering, it was being blasted out of the water by Intel's LGA 1156 and LGA 1366 multi-core lineups. These CPUs were good, but way overpriced, and AMD saw a niche to be filled with customers. Team Red wanted to bring that multi-core goodness to market with budget in mind, and so with great anticipation, in April of 2010, the X6 1090T launched. This processor brought the same IPC as the X4965, but added 2 more cores for a total of 6, and an unlocked multiplier for easy overclocking. It featured the same TDP as the earlier 965 at 125 watts, and even better, it was backwards compatible to AMD's previous generation of motherboard chipset, the AM2 Plus platform. This was great news for gamers with an outdated motherboard looking to get that new hotness. And to top it all off, it launched for just $295 back in the day, which was way lower than the competition. So today we're going to see how it stacks up in some more modern titles. Our test system is housed in an NZXT S340 case. We're cooling with a Noctua D15 to get the most out of our processor, and it was needed. The CryoRig H7 I originally paired it with just wouldn't cut it, so its much larger counterpart was swapped in. To eliminate bottlenecks to the CPU, I overclocked it to 4.1 GHz and paired it with 16 GB of HyperX Fury DDR3 1600 and a GTX 980 Ti. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the gaming benchmarks. Overwatch is our lead title here. Released in May 2016, this game is known to be forgiving of low-end hardware, and so it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that it achieved great results. The Phenom knocked this game out of the park with an average FPS of 99 and a 1% low of 65 at the game's highest graphical preset, Epic. The setting's name is actually Epic. Now, I like to stick to presets as often as I can so that you guys at home can fire up the game, if you own it, and easily replicate my settings for comparisons to your own systems. This playthrough you see here was nothing less than smooth and problem-free. It was the only match that I won, but as you can see, there's no room for me to blame it on the CPU. Moving on, we come to 2016's Doom. This title, just like the one before it, Overwatch, is absolutely forgiving of low-end hardware, be it the CPU, the graphics card, take your pick. It'll let you play all of them with settings that you actually wouldn't expect, and here we see that in full swing. We're playing Doom at Ultra with an average of 87 and a 1% low of 54. Now, I couldn't catch that drop to 54. This entire playthrough was absolutely smooth from start to finish. Didn't matter how many enemies were on the level, didn't matter what weapons were used, explosions, none of it. It just wasn't really slowing this 980 Ti down. Could we have gotten better FPS with another processor? Sure, but this Phenom II X6 absolutely steps up to the plate for this title. One thing is for sure, it gets Doom's seal of approval, hands down. Our next title is Star Wars Battlefront II, a game that EA launched in 2017 with a great deal of controversy about a loot box system that they implemented in the game. It basically created a pay-to-win scenario and left a bad taste in just everyone's mouths. However, setting all of that aside, from day one, I have admired and enjoyed this game. It's just been excellent. It corrected the issues of the first game, and it's very forgiving on PC hardware in the same way that the previous two games are. Here we see in Star Wars Battlefront 2's Ultra settings, Galactic Assault, fighting on the ground with large-scale infantry battles. We're achieving an average of 71 FPS and a 1% low of 49. Once again, I didn't notice that dip down to 49. Not sure where it took place. Overall, everything was very smooth, very enjoyable. So, moving on to our second segment for this game, covering Starfighter Assault because it behaved so differently. As you can see by the numbers on the screen, even though it feels like there's a lot more going on, it's more busy, you're constantly turning, things swarming around you, laser fire everywhere, it's less demanding on the CPU. Go figure. Here at Ultra settings still, the exact same settings we were using for Galactic Assault, so there's no need to sit and fiddle with settings in between matches or anything. We saw an average of 110 FPS with a 1% low of 90 FPS. Now, Keep in mind that the skew is going to be off a little bit, both in Galactic Assault and Starfighter, because when you go to the respawn screen, it actually jacks your FPS up by a good 40-50 FPS. Keep that in mind when you're doing your own benchmarking, your own recording of this game. Absolutely no hiccups, no hangups. This is my favorite game mode of the entire game, and this CPU absolutely kills it in a good way. So moving on to our fourth title, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. You may have noticed the trend already so far with our lineup of games. You're gonna see more demanding titles come and hit this phenom, and as we progress, you're gonna see where it starts to hit its limitations. Everything so far has been gravy, and some of you are probably thinking, oh, he's not gonna really give it a fair test, he's not stressing the CPU, they're all gimmies. No, I promise you we're gonna get to that point. Here, playing PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds at Ultra, we're averaging 70 FPS with a 1% low of 34. Now, I did notice the brief moments where we dropped down to that 1% low. I don't feel like they detracted from my experience, and I wanted to show you the maximum of what this CPU could let you achieve. Now, I know competitive players will play it much lower, and it's gonna do better. Overall, a success for PUBG. Speaking of difficult titles to play, here we have The Witcher 3. Now, the famous Hairworks is off, but we're playing this game at Ultra. I was wandering the countryside near the beginning of the game because I'm not very far myself in it at all. I've just started. We achieved an average of 69 FPS and a 1% low of 43. Now, I did notice these dips, especially when entering a new large area. Everything is starting to kind of render in. I noticed the drops down. Areas with lots of civilians or lots of other characters on the screen also hit it pretty hard. And I can only imagine that going into a larger city would absolutely cause the frames to take that plummet down to where that 1% low becomes kind of the norm. And of course the CPU is going to be our limiter there. This, however, is intended to give you just a general idea of the gameplay. Overall, not being a competitive multiplayer game, I still found the experience very enjoyable, and at ultra settings, this game is just downright beautiful. It's very visually stunning, and this CPU didn't detract from that. Unlike the next title, Fallout 4 is notorious for some optimization issues that plague it, especially with this CPU, despite the fact that it's the oldest title that we've covered so far in this entire lineup. You'd think that would make it more forgiving, but it doesn't. You can see micro stutters, you can see a bit of screen tearing at the beginning. When you're out in the open wasteland, it's pretty steady 59 to 60 FPS, but those drops down to 42 hurt more than you think they would. And even dropping settings down to the lowest possible, the results were absolutely the same. There's no getting around it. Unfortunately, the Phenom doesn't get a pass for this game. Carrying on into our next to last title for our lineup, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands was played at the high preset. I didn't tweak any additional settings, and I achieved an average of 56 FPS with a 1% low of 42. Now you'll note that the FPS is continuing to trend downward as we're taxing the CPU more and more with more demanding titles. However, in the case of this title, unlike Fallout 4, I found that even in the midst of those dips down to the 40s, that it was still pretty smooth. The transition was smooth, and the play didn't really detract from the experience at all. Even moving in a fast car, even in a firefight with lots of characters interacting, I felt it was a very good experience, and despite the numbers on paper, I think the Phenom gets a pass for this one. Wrapping everything up is Warhammer Vermintide 2. Now this game is reminiscent of Valve's Left 4 Dead series in the sense that 4 players will cooperatively try to conquer a level while hordes of enemies rush in at them. And it was these hordes of enemies that ended up being the Phenom's undoing. Played at high settings, low settings, it didn't really matter. Even with all of the CPU intensive settings specifically set to off or low, it didn't throw any bones in the direction of the Phenom. Unfortunately, I let my team down several times due to the bad performance. While we achieved an average of 58, every time the horde came at us, we hit that 1% low of 30. In summary, you're not going to enjoy your experience in this game with this chip. Unfortunately, it fails. In the end, overall, what we've seen is a pretty astonishing success for this aging 6-core processor, this flagship of the old AM3 platform. And even though it came before Ryzen, well before FX even, it still has something to bring to the table. And if you were considering doing a budget build for your child, for a friend, someone just starting out, and you can get your hands on this thing cheap, get a hold of a motherboard, some cheap DDR3 RAM, you can actually build a system that someone could enjoy for another year, another 2 years, another 3 years, depending on the titles that they want to play. That being said, now that we're coming to the end here, I just want to thank you guys for watching this video and bearing with me. I promise that things will continue to improve. Hopefully you noticed improvements over my last video. I'm trying every time that I sit down. I'm learning my software, I'm learning my camera, and it's just an absolute pleasure to bring this stuff to you. And hopefully you're not suffering too much to make it through. Anyway, thank you, YouTube. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe below. This has been X-Ray Tech.